became an abolitionist really from my own life experience and witnessing the ways in which incarceration and policing did more harm. I wouldn't even say then good, did just harm. And really was trying to figure out how I was in relationship to the state and what I wanted to imagine. And I went to my first critical resistance workshop probably 2005, 2006. And I learned the term prison abolitionist. And that opened me up to a lot. Well, I learned the term prison industrial complex, and then from there, prison abolitionist. And that really opened up my mind about what was possible. And the thing I think that stood out for me the most in that moment was that, critical resistance was asking us to imagine something radically different than what we grew up with and what we understood was actually truth. And that was a really powerful opening for me.
Tight. So, Taina, you want us to read through the agenda? Okay. So today we'll define prison abolition. We'll go through the history of abolition. We'll talk about the systems change aspect of prison abolition, the culture change abolition, the culture change aspect of abolition. Then we're going to do like a cool like practice where we're going to give everybody will have the opportunity. Well, everyone won't go because there's a lot of us, but folks who so choose and who we have the time for will have the opportunity to practice some abolition and to apply the skill right here on the Zoom call, and then we'll do questions. I do want to, I keep looking at the thing, Patrisse, because I'm like trying to see when I should go or not go. It's like very weird way of co-presenting a thing. Okay.
You go and then I'll go.
Cool. Prison abolition is a movement to end the culture and system based on punishment and caging and build a culture and system based on accountability, healing, and community solutions. So I think something that's really important for us to walk away with is that abolition is not just about getting rid of prisons, but it's also about building something new. And when we say something new, we don't mean like a replacement to the prison system. So oftentimes, at least as an abolitionist, people ask me like, well, if we get rid of prisons, what are we going to put in their place? And the answer is that we're not looking to put anything in their place. Prisons are right now being used as a catch-all system for all harm that is done in society. And to replace one catch-all system with another catch-all system is actually not an abolitionist move. That's a reform. At the heart of abolition, we're saying that human beings have always created harm, that harm exists, and each situation of harm is unique and needs to be dealt with in a way that will transform that harm and make sure that that particular act of harm doesn't happen again, both at a societal level and by the individual who actually did the harm. And there's no catch-all medicine, if you will, that will stop all acts of harm evenly, especially in that prison.
And I'll just add to that, which is, I think it's important as we're defining terms to really look at some of the things that are named in this definition. Punishment. We live in a culture that is not just advocates for punishment, but every single interaction we have when we are hurt or harmed, whether it's personally or it's like statewide government based, like the act is always about punishing the other person or punishing another human being. And I think this is very important. We'll talk about it later in this presentation, but if we don't sort of get to the root of our obsession with punishment, this abolition becomes a... Sorry, guys. That was my child. That was a happy scream, by the way, not like a scary scream. Happy to see his dad. And that probably won't happen again because now the team is here. But welcome to Zooming and webinaring in quarantine. So yeah, like the punishment piece feels really critical to me as we're communicating this project of abolition, this experiment of abolition, because we all really, a lot of us believe in punishment. Even if we don't think we do, it's one of the first places people go to. And it's because we've been trained around that. And I think the other piece of this conversation around this definition is caging. Many of us don't think about a human being going to jail as putting them in a cage, but it is. You know, we have a lot of sort of in popular culture, we have a lot of animal rights activists who, you know, are upset about putting chickens in cages, and I'm upset about that too. But I'm just saying, like, upset about putting chickens in cages and animals in cages, and yet those same people are okay with putting human beings in cages. And so this idea that we need to eliminate the practice of punishing and putting human beings in cages is very, very important. And the last thing I'll say about this definition, as Richie said before, is okay, well then how are we supposed to respond if we're not supposed to punish and we're not supposed to cage? There's a new strategy in which we can be different kinds of human beings. Prison abolition asks every single one of us to be a different kind of human being, and that's very important. A human being that is rooted in figuring out what accountability looks like, what healing looks like, and what our community-driven solutions look like. Not a judge, not a police officer, not a random stranger who knows nothing about our lives or our history, who probably had a very different experience from us, but rather the community. Because when I've had loved ones end up in jail or prison, I kid you not, our community could have came up with solutions around how to deal with that. And so I think that's really important. The community-driven solutions piece is critical because prison abolition cannot be practiced unless it's in community. We don't practice abolition as individuals, we practice it as a team.
So, can y'all hear me?
Mm-hmm.
If it alarms you, the idea of thinking about the abolition of prisons, which also includes the abolition of the police and the abolition of our government system of harm, I want to say that that's okay. That's not. There's no judgment towards that. We're talking about a world that is radically different from the one we have, and it might be hard to imagine, given that unless you're over 700 years old, this is the system that you've always known. Or especially unless you're over 150 years old, then this is definitely the system you've always known as it pertains to the United States. But it's important for us to know that for the first 199,850 years of human existence, there was no prisons. And yet here we are, we made it. So the idea of prisons are actually very new and clearly not required for human safety or survival, because we didn't have them for a very long time, and yet we made it. So just to give a couple examples of what that looked like, there was a myriad of indigenous cultures throughout the world over the course of that almost 200,000 years of history that had their own ways of practicing justice, their own ways of practicing harm reduction, their own ways of keeping each other safe. So I'll just talk about a couple of them. There was the Maori practice the Maori is the name of a tribe in New Zealand, an indigenous tribe in New Zealand. And they had the practice of what's now kind of called utu justice, which comes from the Maori word utu, or balance, or the idea that for every action that happens, something has to happen to put it back into balance. So they had a whole practice of when an act of harm happened, their folks would sit in circle and the community would come up with some kind of solution or some kind of reaction that had to happen to put things back in balance, which could be anything from somebody getting jacked. We have to figure out a way for them to get their stuff back, and we have to figure out a way for them to feel like they can trust this other person again. We need to put things back in balance, right? So this was something that was about solving problems and bringing the community back into balance and accord with one another, as opposed to harming the individual. Now, what's interesting, I think important about the idea of Utu, or the justice, the kind of justice system that the Maori built around Utu, was everything wasn't light and fluffy. I think sometimes people hear abolition and they imagine a world without accountability or consequences. That's not the case, but I do think that it's important to point out there's a difference between consequences and punishment. And the difference is that consequences are natural. They are begged for by reality. Punishment is a purposeful act of revenge against a person who committed harm. So by that, I mean this. When I was a child, my dad used to tell me, don't play in the street. I would say, why? He would say, because you can get hit by a car. That is a natural consequence of a small person, under 3 feet tall, playing around in a street where cars are driving. That's not a punishment. If I were to get hit by a car, it's not like anybody did that to punish me. That is a natural consequence of my actions. So likewise, in Utu justice, they understood that there is consequences to people's actions. You stole something, you're going to have to give it back, or you're going to have to work, or you're going to have to do something that then you might not like that. They even sometimes define it as actions, friendly or unfriendly actions that happen as natural consequences to restate the balance in the community. Some other examples a little closer to home. We have the examples of the First Nations of Canada and indigenous tribes in the northeastern United States, also southeastern Canada and the Yukon area, that also had their own way of like circle justice, where justice was figured out in the circle. And it was said that the circle was always happening. It didn't just happen at the moment of harm, but the community was always in circle, always checking in on one another, always seeing what everybody needs for everybody to be okay, including addressing acts of harm that were happening in the community, which was similar to the practice that was happening in the Great Plains from the nations of the Great Plains of the United States, who also had justice systems that are called circle justice. And you can see a lot of cool, I don't know if I want to call it cool, but a lot of just really resilient examples of how indigenous communities to this day are keeping up that tradition of circle justice and restorative justice.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, I mean, Rich gave a lot of examples, and I'll just give 2 others. One was in 2011, I went and visited Nigeria, and I was going to school in Ile-Ife, and one of the first things I saw was this man being sort of paraded across campus, and people beating him up. It was shocking. And I was like, what's going on? They're like, he did something really terrible to a woman, and this is the community response. And while I'm not sort of like advocating for community violence, there was this way in which the fact there were no police involved, that there was not a system in place that would give that person, years upon years and rip him from his community, but in fact, it was different. He had to face his community. He had to deal with his community. And I think that's something that's really powerful when we're thinking about an abolitionist culture, is that we're asking people to face their community, to face the community members that have done harm, and face the community members that you've harmed, and be in accountability that is very different from having to sit in front of a judge, be taken from your community, and in many ways be shamed in that process. And all that shame does, it does not actually allow us to heal or create accountability. Shame creates a cycle of guilt and a cycle of an inability to actually deal with what the issue that happened in the first place. And I think that's really important. And I think we've seen cultures that not just in history, but in current time, are choosing something different, choosing a different path. When I visited Australia in 2016, I sat with a lot of Aboriginal communities, and they were talking about how the system of incarceration from the US was, the government there was trying to model the system that came here in Australia, and it was an epic failure. And I asked, the person that I was speaking with, why was it an epic failure? And she was like, because we've already had our own systems in place around accountability, and this created more harm. And so imagine, you know, them understanding it very quickly and then course correcting. We have not course corrected. And that takes me, I think, to the last point. When we use this term abolition, it does, it is a term that's rooted in history. The first abolitionist movement that called itself that was the abolition of slavery. And in fact, that was one of the first systems in this country, and I would say around the world, that really celebrated and allowed for bondage, the bondage of human beings. That's a first sort of visible, the foundation of this country is obviously built off of slavery and the bondage of human beings. And so it's not far away from how we are relating to incarcerated bodies. And so Angela Davis actually coined the term prison abolitionist, and she coined it from the abolitionist movement. Oh, you can mute me because there's my dog.
If I could say something really quick before we move on to the next slide. I think it's important to point out how many people have heard folks say that like prisons, and this to Patrisse's point, that prisons are like modern day slavery, right? And where that comes from, I think in addition to Patrisse's point of like just the actual systemized caging of human beings, it also in a very literal way, when slavery was ended, as many of us know, the 13th Amendment of the Constitution said slavery is illegal except for as punishment of a crime. And that was a very purposeful move, because then the next move, slavery then splintered into a bunch of other systems, the peonage system, and as well as sharecropping and convict leasing. And convict leasing was about criminalizing Black folks so that you can put them in prison, and then once they were in prison, you could enslave them again, and the prisons could actually lease out their labor. So this might be hard for us to imagine as people who grew up in this era, but prior to the end of slavery, there were no Black people in prison. There was actually very few prisons at all. Prisons were actually more of a church thing, and they were really there so you could, it wasn't about punishing you necessarily as much as it was about that's why it's called a penitentiary. You would go and have penance. It was a Catholic thing. You go in and you're supposed to sit with yourself and sit with God, and then you come out and you understand what you did wrong. That's how prisons were used. They were very few and far in between. They're about 500 years old. But for the most part, when people had beef with each other, they dealt with it in the civil system. They would sue each other over it. You killed my brother, I want some of your land, whatever. It was something like that. It wasn't until after slavery that we got the system we have now, where now all of a sudden for crimes, there had to be an amount of time that you had to be in prison, because now once they could put people in prison, primarily Black folks, they could then lease out that labor to governments. They could lease out that labor to plantations. They can lease out that labor to private people. And I would say most famously, if you look at Angola State Penitentiary in Louisiana, it was at once the Angola Family Plantation. There's still cotton fields at that prison to this day. Also, much of the infrastructure of the city of Atlanta and the city of Washington, D.C. were made by leased convict labor or slave labor under the convict leasing system. So to talk about some of the abolitionist theorists, I'll talk about the person whose work I'm most familiar with. Angela Davis, Black Panther writer, activist, was the person who coined the term the prison industrial complex and coined the term prison abolition in the 90s. And I will let Patrisse talk about the rest. She knows much more than I do.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I think these are people that we wanted to kind of just share with you. We won't do a super deep dive because folks should do it themselves, but Audre Lorde, obviously a profound activist, feminist, lesbian, who in a lot of ways don't think she necessarily coined herself as an abolitionist, but the way in which she talked about healing and transformation and self was incredibly important, and I think in many ways lays the foundation for much of my own feminist and abolitionist practice. She's just profound. She's really, really profound. I really think people should read her essays, her poetry, her books. Frantz Fanon is a brilliant theorist. Much of his challenge was to white supremacy and US imperialism. And he created a foundation knowledge around Black liberation movements. And so just also a really important theoretician. And as Rich said, Angela Davis, I think, is probably the most famous prison abolitionist. And in the 90s coined the term as was one of the co-founding members of Critical Resistance. Angela, I think, gave us a term as a conversation and as a challenge to how we were doing criminal justice reform. As many of us know now, the 90s was both riddled with, two terms of a Democratic government, Bill Clinton's 2 terms as president, and Bill Clinton's 2 terms as he went into office. It was a time when we had already just had 2 terms of George Senior Bush. So people were trying to urge for a democratic, national democratic government. And instead what we got was someone who was rather centric, who made a deal with Republicans and turned the Democratic Party into a party that was about the 3 strikes, that was about law and order. And it was a way to appease the Republican Party. And so Angela really comes out with this term, prison abolitionist, in response to that moment in the 90s when she was witnessing and we were seeing the rise of incarcerating whole entire communities. And many of us, I think both millennials, younger and older millennials, were many of us are the children of incarcerated people. We watched our loved ones, our family members. Many of us became incarcerated during that time. That was a very particular time, and that was a bipartisan effort that really took out, Black poor people, undocumented communities. And so I think this was Angela's effort to intervene in what was happening. And it would take, almost 30 years later for many of us to start to say, oh, maybe we should believe in abolition, or maybe we should challenge the Democratic Party. And I think it was an important intervention.
So what prison abolition is at its core, systemically, means to abolish the institutions that uphold the punishment police state. So right now, the way that our society pretty much works is that any harm that is done or supposedly done, or I should say not even just harm, but crime. So there's a difference between harm and crime. Something can be illegal and not necessarily harmful, right? And something can be harmful and not necessarily illegal. But any crime that is done is then the responsibility of the state, meaning the government, using the police to go kidnap that person. They call it arresting, and then hold them at gunpoint, hundreds of miles away from their family for some kind of arbitrary amount of time that a legislator or lawmaker made up for whatever reason. And we call those places prisons, or detention centers, or juvenile halls. So all of those institutions throughout that whole chain that make them happen would all be abolished within prison abolition. So it would be the abolishment of the police, the abolishment of ICE, the abolishment of the court system as we now have it, the abolishment of prisons, the abolishment of jails, the abolishment of the right of the government to take away human beings for quote unquote committing a crime.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that we haven't actually mentioned around abolition is the abolishing of surveillance. I think this is, a really critical piece of thinking about the prison and police state. As the prison and police state grows, so does the surveillance state. And there is a deep need for us, I think, many of us, and depending on communities, right? I think Muslim communities, Black communities, folks who have been on probation and parole, that is a form of surveillance. I think if we think about the ways in which schools are created, really we live in a surveillance culture. And so the abolishing of surveillance is critical. And I think the creation of transformative alternatives becomes sort of the place where we turn the corner around what we're abolishing and start talking about what we're creating and what we're developing. And the reality is harm and violence is always going to happen. It depends on the culture you're in, on what extent, right? There's a phenomenon in this culture of mass shootings. That's not something that happens everywhere. Unfortunately, our national government has created, well, let me say it differently. Our national government hasn't empowered white supremacy across the globe. So we're now seeing mass shootings in places like Canada, or the mass shooting that happened in New Zealand. These are not things that are the foundation of these governments, but are these places. But I think it's important that we name that harm and violence will happen. And based off of that harm and violence, we do have to have a clear path around transformation and accountability. And transformation is not just to transform what happened to the person who was harmed, but also to transform the person who did the harm, because we don't want harm to happen again. And this is critical for us if we're talking about abolition, because it's not just a theory, it's also a practice. It's something that we do. And I think the last point, and then I'm pretty sure I'll just kick it back over to Richie to expound on it, but investing in community. Part of, and I think in this COVID-19 moment, we've seen a lot of this, which is people are starting to know who their neighbors are. People are doing way more mutual aid than they've ever done in their lives. But this is actually the basis of having an abolitionist culture, is taking care of each other and investing in the people around you. It's much more difficult to harm someone you're invested in. It's much more difficult to harm a community that you believe in and that believes in you and that's invested in you. So this is not just about monetary investment. This is an emotional and a spiritual investment. And I think that's really important, because what we've seen, the antithesis of an abolitionist culture has been a complete divestment from human beings, a complete divestment from poor people, from Black people, from brown people, from undocumented communities, and an othering of them and letting them know you're not invested in, we don't care about you. That translates into people's bodies, into people's actions. And I think this part and an abolitionist culture is really redeveloping our value in community.
Yeah, I'd love to say just a couple more things. When we talk about creating transformative alternatives, so right now under the punishment state, justice that's based on revenge, or quote unquote punishment, which is just a diet word for revenge, the purpose of the way that justice functions is justice is served when an equal or greater harm was done to the original harm doer. So in retributive justice, as it's also called, I punch you, you punch me, justice is served. And the kind of alternatives we're talking about, you have two of them. You have restorative justice and you have transformative justice. Restorative justice says, justice isn't achieved when you've harmed me back. Justice is achieved when the original person who was harmed is restored to their fullest state, or the best state that they can be. And transformative justice, like Patrisse was saying, says that justice is achieved when not only has the situation been transformed from one of harm to one of healing, but also when the person who did the original harm, when their behavior has changed. So the goal of transformative justice is to transform behavior rather than just hurt the person who did the hurt in the first place. And I would say it goes farther to also transform the systems that led to that behavior in the first place, which is why as we get into the culture change, you'll see that there really is no prison abolition without also abolishing other things that create the kind of dis-ease in our communities that lead to harm in the first place, such as poverty, which is a symptom of capitalism, and violence, which is a symptom of patriarchy, sexual violence, which is a symptom of patriarchy, right? So it's transformative justice also fights those systems. It's not just you did something wrong and now I need to punish you, or even now I need to transform you. It's you did something wrong. That is a symptom of a larger system that needs to be transformed. And finally, speaking on investing in community, I had the privilege to go study the public safety systems in Finland and Norway, which are not perfect public safety systems by any means. But what they did understand was that you actually reduce harm in communities by giving people what they need. So when talking in Finland, for example, what they did a big study in the 90s, which they used to then transform their prison system, because up until the 90s, they had one much like ours. And they said what they found is the number one way to get rid of drug crime is to decriminalize the use of drugs. They said the number one way to get rid of property crime is to have what's called universal basic income, or basically give everybody what they need to survive. If somebody isn't making the amount of money that it requires to survive in that society, it is given to them. And that wiped out most of, or almost all of, their property crime. And really interestingly, they said, and this really goes to Patrisse's point about how folks of oppressed folks have been marginalized. They said what they found is the number one most effective way to get rid of violent crime is to marginalize communities that are otherwise, or excuse me, to demarginalize or to enfranchise communities that are otherwise marginalized or disenfranchised. So they put together a violence reduction task force that had no cops, that had no guns. And what the folks on this violence reduction task force did is they went out into communities, poor communities, immigrant communities, communities of color, and they enrolled people to vote. They got people signed up for jobs. They got people signed up for healthcare. They got people signed up for education. And lo and behold, the level of violence in those communities went down by 75%.
How can we fight? Sorry, I'm like moving the chat screen. I'm moving the box with all the people in it. How can we fight? How we fight for systems change to truly abolish prisons? Reform versus abolition. So this is a term that I also learned from, I learned this term actually from Treva. Treva is a good friend of mine, works at Cal Poly Pomona now. And this term is called non-reformist reforms. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, we want to get rid of all these systems and we want to create a new system, a system that is based on community care and dignity and health and healing and wholeness. But it takes time to get there. And so how do we get there? What are the steps? One of the first places we have to think about when we're building our institutions, our abolitionist institutions, I consider IJ an abolitionist institution, is thinking about how we do the work. What are we asking for? What are we demanding? And a non-reformist reform, and if you have your notes, I see it. I love the people with their pens and papers. If you're doing it on your computer or on your phone, amazing. You can ask Richie, I'm a big fan of pen and paper. Get your notes out. Is that you don't want to, a non-reformist reform does not grow the police or prison state or surveillance state. So that means, I'll give you an example. The work that IJ has done to get people good time credits so they can get home early or out of jail. Rich was one of those people. That is a non-reformist reform. We're getting people home. We're getting them home early. Getting folks the right back to vote, a non-reformist reform. And that's a revolutionary demand, actually. But all the ways in which we challenge the police state or the prison state should be a thing that doesn't grow it. I'll give you an example of a reform that actually grew the police state. And it came out of not Black Lives Matter. We didn't call for this, but the time in which there was a height of Black Lives Matter and the conversation was like, how do we stop police violence? And remember, the biggest demand that came out, that was the popular demand, was you just got to put a body camera on them and then everything will be okay. A body camera is, it feels benign, like, we'll just, yeah, body camera is great. Like, we'll see more, we'll have more transparency, but we didn't realize when we were making the demand, I wasn't making it, I'm just identifying with the larger movement. When people were making the demand of a body camera, they're actually growing the police state by giving more dollars to the police, by saying, oh, if the police just had more cameras, they'll do a better job, when in fact their job is to kill and abuse. So there's no better job in that. And we've seen over and over again that even when the police have their body cameras, what do? Turn them off, manipulate them, try not to use them. If they do, in fact, the body camera's on and they do kill someone, do they get convicted? So this becomes a really important conversation for us around non-reformist reforms. We do not want to grow the police and prison state. We want to build out reforms that will decrease its budgets, decrease its ability to harm our communities. And you can always figure that out in a group, right? If it's like, okay, a bunch of you are going to start a campaign, you're thinking about all the demands of the campaign, every campaign should be vetted. Is this going to grow the police and prison surveillance state, or is this going to shrink it? And it's always, I believe, you take that to budget. Will this grow its budget, or does this take money away from it? Does this starve it? And that's very, very important. Last example, Los Angeles, we stopped two $3.5 billion jails. Obviously, that was a non-reformist reform. Don't build the jail. But there was always something on the table, which is, if we don't build that jail, should we build a smaller jail? Not once ever in our local movement did we call for the building of a smaller jail, because we knew if we went with the reform that was like, don't build that jail, but you could build a smaller jail, of course they would take that up. We said no jail whatsoever. And for a decade we said, here are all the people, here's all the jail population. All of these folks actually need things like housing, things like food, things like shelter, access to public education. They need support and care and dignity. They don't need a jail cell. And if we start there, if we start with building communities of care, collectives of care, cities of care, that really challenges the other places that have been built, that have been prioritized, which are prisons.
I think to that point too, something that comes up a lot in the statewide movement is the pitting of different groups or people who are affected by different laws against each other. So something that we have never done at Initiate Justice is invested our time or efforts or money into any law that will only affect people now who are not yet in prison, but will not actually free people who are in prison. So for example, there's laws, and that's no diss to people, to organizations who have passed those laws. They're trying to stop people from going into jail, which is fair. Though I would also say it's somewhat reformist, because it's not, it allows us to leave some people out. And we see, at least I saw when I was in prison, oftentimes groups of people who had different sentences would kind of demonize each other. Well, I'm just a three-striker. It's not like I committed a murder. You should let me out. Or I just, this is my first time. It's not like I've been in prison multiple times. You should let me out. And those kinds of things, that's when we start getting into reform. There was actually a law that somebody wrote, and I think that they were well-intentioned. It was somebody in the movement who I respect very much, but at the time I would call it a reformist reform, where they were saying, we should get rid of 3 strikes for people who have these nonviolent third strikes, but for everybody else, we're actually going to make it so that they get more time. And those kinds of things are what we're talking about when we're saying reforms that actually invest more into the system. And I think this is a really, really important point, because I don't think that we should get on the tip of like, are you an abolitionist or not? If you're not, then therefore I can't work with you. But we should be very aware that reformists and abolitionists actually have 2 very different goals. You have a group of folks who are saying, prisons, police, those are needed things, but we've just went too far and we just need to dial it back a little bit. That's a reformist vision, as opposed to abolitionists who are saying, no, actually this whole system of control is actually unnecessary. It actually exists to get people elected, to make money, and to use Black, brown, queer, undocumented, marginalized bodies as chattel and collateral to do that. And we're not down with anything that does that. And it's really important that we see the difference in those, and that even if we choose to create alliances with people who may not necessarily be abolitionists, that we understand that in the long run, we have a very different vision in them, and there will come a time where we might not be able to work together, because we're going to be saying, no, we want to go back to the first 200,000 years of human history where we didn't put people in cages, while they're saying, no, we want to work with the cops. We just want them to be a little less violent, or to give a little less extreme of sentences, or what have you.
I know I'm not a presenter, but I'm going to go ahead and exercise my authority as the host to jump in on this conversation, just because I think I'm really glad that you brought that up, Richard, in talking about making sure that when we are fighting for freedoms, we're not doing it at the expense of others. Like, it's not an abolitionist framework. Perfect example. Today I saw a news article circulating on social media about a handful of folks who are convicted of sex offenses in Orange County jails who are being released due to COVID. And I was saddened, but not surprised to see that all of the people who shared it were people who I'm in this movement with. and they were saying, I can't believe they're letting these sex offenders out. You know, what about my loved one? My loved one only did this thing. These people, you know, they should rot there. I don't care what happens to them. So I just wanted to highlight, because that's like that's something that comes up often, especially when we're talking about something as sensitive as sex offenses, right? Because it's very valid and it's very real, and we want communities to be safe. We want, you know, women and children and whoever to be safe, of course. But if we're talking about true community safety, we have to talk about building systems and ending caging in ways that benefits everybody, and not just, you know, a handful of folks who we see as more or less deserving. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Taina. I'd love to just take a second to talk specifically about sex offenses, because I think that often comes up where, you know, you talk about prison abolition, and the number one question you get is, what about the rapists and the murderers? And I want to validate that people's like fear of this kind of harm is valid, and people who have survived sexual violence are rightfully very angry and want to make sure that doesn't happen. And prison abolition actually is I would say, taking a stronger stance than retributive justice in terms of ending sexual violence as a thing. And that's the big takeaway I hope everybody walks away with this from, is that abolition says we want to stop negative behavior. The prison police state says we want to encage, control, and profit off human beings who have possibly committed harmful behavior. So Me Too Behind Bars, who released a video today, in that one of the leaders, Rojas, said, prisons are sexual violence. There is to lock somebody in a cage, to strip search somebody, to make that a mandatory act, that is sexual violence, right? Children get strip searched, women get strip searched. Regardless of your gender, you get strip searched in prison. Prisons require sexual violence. So to say, I'm against sexual violence, therefore I want prisons, is an oxymoron. You're trying to solve one with the other. What abolitionists are actually saying is, we want to take down the cultures that create sexual violence in the first place, and we actually believe in our communities enough to hold folks accountable when they have perpetrated sexual violence, when we empower those communities with the tools they need to do so.
One thing I'll say on that is there's, I don't want to click out of Zoom, so I didn't put the link up, but in the chat I wrote, go to Generation 5's website, and they have an amazing pamphlet on child sexual abuse and ending it in 5 generations. They were an amazing organization, and thanks, Liz. And it's one of the most pivotal documents I've ever read, because Generation 5, we don't need to spend a whole lot of time on this, but Generation 5 really created a theory and opened up a conversation around how we deal with sexual violence and harm in our communities, and how do we deal with it without the police and prisons, because it's the most probably taboo subject, and they thought it was the best place to start us with. And so I want to encourage this audience to go ahead and read that.
Do y'all want me to go to the next slide?
Yeah, I think so. I think we covered that in what we were saying.
Okay.
So we talked about how to really have the abolition that we're talking about, we don't just need to change systems, but we need to change culture as well, right? We can only change systems as far as culture will let us. If we tried to pass initiate justice, we run into this problem every year when we sit down and we're looking over the different bills that we've gotten from our members all over the state, and we're trying to put together our strategy for the year. Of course, we get people who write in and say, write a bill to let all the lifers go, write a bill to get rid of LWOP, write a bill to get rid of 3 strikes. And unfortunately, we can only write bills that will be politically supported, and things will only be politically supported when we have cultural buy-in. Now, it is true we have a lot more cultural buy-in than the legislature often uses, because they have other things driving their behavior, but culture is really what allows us to have abolition. If we were to tomorrow open up all the prisons and let everybody go, we don't currently have a culture of community that even knows how to deal with that. So some key proponents of culture that we would need to change, and I'll just maybe talk about the first one, and then kind of piggyback off you, Patrisse, is revenge versus accountability. So even culturally, even interpersonally, oftentimes when we're hurt by somebody, we have then been trained to want to hurt them or to want to see them hurt. I think it's important to point out that there is a degree of that anger that we feel towards them that is natural, but we've also been trained to think that way, right? It's culturally acceptable to think that way. Every movie we've ever seen, especially as kids, pretty much goes like this. Bad guy does something bad to the good guy, and then the good guy comes in and does something bad to the bad guy, and we all cheer because now victory was won, right? And we might even respond to harm in our own lives that way. This person has hurt me, and now I'm not talking to them anymore. Or this person has hurt me, and now I want to see them hurt. As long as we have this aspect of our culture, I mean, we live in a culture where we hit children, right? Where it's okay to act violent against helpless children. That is seen as okay, and sometimes even applauded. And it's important to point out that when somebody is being hurt, that's not actually accountability. Accountability is understanding the harm that you did to somebody, and then therefore, because you understand it so deeply, you are then moved to try to right that harm and make sure that it never happens again. That is true accountability. And as somebody who was locked up for 7 years and has been involved with the criminal legal system since I was 11 years old, there is no accountability in the criminal legal system, because all you're doing is I became the victim. I became the victim when I was first arrested at 11 and 12 and 13 and 14 and 15 and 16, right? I was the one who was in juvenile hall, in jail, in prison, fighting for my life, trying to survive. I wasn't thinking about the people I robbed or the people I harmed. That wasn't what was at the forefront of my mind. Survival was at the forefront of my mind, because now I was the receiver of harm, and there's no actual accountability in that.
Yeah, I love that people are sharing all these documents. Beyond Survival is a great one. I think, to shift culture, you have to shift yourself. We make up culture, we create culture. You have to shift institutions. Some of them need to be abolished, we believe, obviously prisons and the police state. And then we have to change how we relate to these institutions. We have to create new ones. We have to create collectives. We have to, value community and care. And so I think, Rich did a good job at revenge versus accountability. We have domination versus collaboration on here. We live in a patriarchal capitalist construct where domination is the only way to be in relationship. And we believe that we need to move out of that model and into a model of how do we do this together? How do we collaborate? This doesn't mean that we don't have leaders or leadership, right? We believe in leadership. We believe in leadership that is rooted in an Ella Baker model that is really about the community. Ella Baker was really critical of social justice movements and civil rights movements that really pitted one person as a savior of that community. That's an old model, and it comes from a very Christian framework. And I think this model of collaboration is a model that's incredibly important, how we understand what's needed and what's possible. I also think that the model of collaboration it makes you invest in yourself. You're not looking for something outside of you to take care of your environment. It makes us look at elected officials differently, right? They have a particular kind of power, but as a collective, as a community, we have way more power to change that elected official's mind, their process, and what they do, and what laws they pass or what they don't pass. That's why organizing is so critical. And I think this idea of punishment versus healing, obviously punishment has been the rule of the land. We opened up this abolitionist conversation with the word punishment. Healing, many call it healing justice, is really, it's not just about an individual and you having your own sort of like eat, pray, love healing moment, but it's about how we heal as a community, collective healing. Much of the harm that has been done to us by the state and by the system is a harm that's not just on one of us, but it's a harm that's happened to us collectively. And so we have to collectively heal.
I think a really good example of those things is last week, and I'll be really general to respect privacy, but last week there was a situation in our community where somebody was threatening to do some violence, and I didn't know what to do, and I called Patrisse, and Patrisse was like, well, who can pull up? Who can pull up to this person's house and just be present and hold space? How can we get as many people who love this person as possible there? Because if you think about it, a lot of us are not gonna act an ass in front of our granny, right? There's actually people who hold us accountable because they love us that we know. And it's only in this very individualist society where we leave people isolated and we expect the dominators, the police, the people who we've appointed to do violence on our behalf, to go show up and dominate and force somebody using violence to stop their harm, as opposed to let's collaborate as a community and show up to stop that same harm. Because again, the goal of abolition is to stop harm, not to dominate people. And same thing with punishment versus healing. Who here has ever had an experience where at first they felt hurt and then they like talk through it with the person to the point, or at the end you're like both crying and you just love each other so much and you just want to like hug it out and you feel better. Those are the kinds of experiences that are actually possible, not just with little things like you scratched my car while you borrowed it. Those kinds of things happen with murders. Those kinds of things happen with sexual assault. It's hard for us to imagine because we were raised in this culture where it's like, no, when somebody does something like that, we need to destroy them. But actually there are moments of healing available after those moments. And that is what a punishment versus healing model looks like. It's building out a whole system and culture that actually invests in our ability to do that with each other. I feel like because it's your quote, Patrisse, I should read it because I don't know how. I don't know how to like.
Well, one thing I'll also say, and thank you for that, Rich. We have like real live examples, and they're not perfect because as we're stumbling towards trying to heal from generations of harm from the state and government, we don't get it always right. But the Truth and Reconciliation process, I think, was one of the most powerful processes that we've had in our generation's lifetime around what a government and system did to its people and how those people were able to relate to each other. If people aren't familiar with the South African Truth and Reconciliation circles, part of what Nelson Mandela did when he became president and he was taken out of prison was he gave the opportunity for individuals to come together and admit the harm they caused. And so there was it was disproportionately Black South Africans admitting harm to white South Africans, but there were really powerful moments of white South Africans admitting harm. There was this powerful moment of a Black South African actually who had killed another Black South African. He was the Black South African was a part of the army, and he was having a circle with the mother of the person that was killed. And it was, I mean, you can find it on YouTube, but it was one of those moments exactly like Richard said. It's not to glamorize these moments, but it's more that we are human beings. And at the end of the day, human beings want to be in connection with each other. It's the times that we are disconnected from each other that's probably the most traumatic. And that's what prisons and jailing and the police do. And so the opportunity that family had to reconcile with the person who killed, that took took that child away from that mother. One of her things that she said, "You look like my son." And it was like, it broke the both of them, and the families cried and processed, and who knows what happened afterwards. But when we don't allow ourselves to heal, and we stay in a cycle of revenge and punishment, we're actually stunting our personal growth and the growth of our descendants, generations to come that will repeat the cycles of alienation, punishment, and revenge. And those are dangerous, dangerous cycles to sit in. And so this is, like we said at the beginning, like abolition is not just about these huge systems we want to get rid of. It's about how we change ourselves and how we show up differently. Oh, it's kind of the quote that's kind of my quote. So we don't need to read it. So I'm writing a book right now, and it's based off of a Harvard Law Review article that I did talking about abolition. And out of that article, I identified these are the 12 abolitionist practices that I really embody in my life. Well, let me say that differently. I try to embody in my life. I'm a human being. I'm working on shit. One of them is courageous conversations. I'm a big fan of the way we develop authentic community is we have to have those hard conversations that might feel uncomfortable. We're not really taught to have courageous conversations. We're taught to have toxic communication. And I think that this piece is a really critical piece of mine. Commit to response versus reaction, experiment, nothing is fixed. When we were going after these jails in LA, we kept being told by local county government that it was done. Stop bringing it up at every fucking meeting. We're building these jails. You know, December 2018, they were supposed to break ground for the women's jail, but we kept experimenting. Nothing is fixed. Nothing is fixed, y'all. We can experiment. I'm a big fan of the imagination. We have to imagine, forgive actively versus passively. I believe in for our ability. Someone did harm to me. I'm gonna work on forgiving them, and not wait for them to come to me to do things that I can forgive them. No, forgiveness is not just forgiveness. There's reciprocity in forgiveness. Allowing yourself to feel. Part of growing up in the U.S. empire is stripping you from your feelings, right? Patriarchy really demands us to not feel. And so allowing yourself to feel, commit to not harming or abusing others. Seems simple, but when we talk shit to people, when we're mean to people, that's harm. Obviously physical abuse, like all those things, those are very hard, especially if you grew up in households where that was really prominent. It's hard to undo that. Practice accountability for harm caused. So whenever I cause harm, if I know I did, I try to apologize. I try to name that what I've caused and show up and say, I'm sorry that I did this. Embrace non-reformist reforms. We talked about that. Build community. We cannot practice abolition in isolation. Value interpersonal relationships. I'm not, at the end of the day, my relationships are really, really important to me, not just because I want to please people, but because I believe in people and I believe people should also believe in me. And so valuing our relationships and our interpersonal relationships are critical. And then my favorite, fight the US state and do not make it stronger. We kind of talked about that earlier. Non-reformist reforms are about that, but when I wake up in the morning, I'm always thinking about how am I changing the material conditions for people most vulnerable. And for me, that's fighting the US state. As long as I can keep building towards a model of care and human dignity, that makes me feel like I am fighting this US state and not making it stronger.
So we're gonna do the questions before the thing?
Yes. So the way that we're going to do questions is I'm going to go ahead and field them. So if y'all could drop your questions in the chat box, you can let me know if they're for Patrisse or Richard, or both, either. And then I will go ahead and facilitate that. So any questions that you have, feel free to send them through.
I'd love to also just like say that there are no dumb questions. This can be a very new topic. Like Patrisse said, nothing is fixed. We're using our imagination. We're always imagining what's possible. So if something felt unclear, or you don't really get it, or maybe you feel like I can't imagine how that would work, I really encourage those questions because other people probably feel the same way.
We have a question here from Evie. And I guess Elizabeth was going to ask the same question, is if you can review the difference between restorative justice and transformative justice.
Sure, great questions coming in. They're just two different theories. Restorative justice comes out of the idea that we have to, the way in which we deal with harm and violence is we have to restore people back to the place that they come from. And transformative justice kind of evolves that theory in that many of us are not from places that can be restored. And we have to actually transform the places that we come from. Many of us don't have the opportunity to be in places that were healthy for us. So we don't want to restore us back to the place that created that harm. We actually have to transform those places. So it's a theoretical difference. And I think there was a crew of people that restorative justice really did come out of many indigenous communities where the places that were existing were places that just needed to be restored and not transformed. But we live in a very different environment. And so transformation is actually critical in this current environment.
Are you gonna add to that, Richard?
Maybe some examples. Yeah, maybe just some examples. So like, an example of restorative justice, Charlene Carruthers, who wrote an amazing book, Unapologetic, talks about in her abolitionist practice, she was like, if she said, you know, she's from Chicago. She said, I've got my car stolen many times. When my car is stolen, all I want is my car back. That's an example of restorative justice, for the community to then come together, help her get her car back, maybe set up a circle with her and the person who stole the car, and have them both talk about their sides of the story. Transformative justice would take it beyond just the moment of her getting her car back, and also take it to transforming the behavior of the person of why did they take the car in the first place, and transform the system of capitalism and poverty that led that person to steal cars in the first place.
Great, thank you, Richard, that's great. The next question, I'm really interested to hear how the both of y'all are gonna respond to this, is from Clara. How do you know when it's time to stop working with reformers?
You know, it's a very good question. I think it depends. There is, sometimes it's about setting boundaries. It doesn't mean you have to completely stop unless you feel like there is too much harm caused that it's even helpful for your work. But I think sometimes naming the boundaries inside of communities is really important, and in relationship to other groups that you're working with. And if they can abide by those boundaries, I think you can continue moving forward. But if they cannot, then, you know, you can set the sort of standard and say, no, we don't want to do this any longer.
Yeah, I would just want to I just want to point out, like, for folks to notice, like, some of the language that Patrisse is using, like stating boundaries. I think that's a very abolitionist practice, right? So there's difference between in retributive justice, the culture we kind of grew up in, we cut people out. We now say, I'm done with this person. You're a reformer, I'm not. You're out of here, I'm not working with you, as opposed to stating a boundary, which is, in what ways can I work with you? In what ways does it not make sense? Is it a natural consequence of what I'm trying to accomplish that I don't work with you, right? And I think that that's more the question, which is when does it serve your goal versus not serve your goal to be working with reformers? You might work with them on a bill today and not on one with them next year, and then maybe work with them again when you can align sometime in the future. But I don't think that there's ever a moment where we say, okay, I'm done with you. I would say that that's antithetical to abolitionism.
Yeah, and I'm gonna field these questions a little bit out of order to keep this conversation going. So there's a question here from Amy. Do you view reforms that would increase the humanity and dignity of folks in cages, improve conditions, as being non-reformist reforms? Concerned that making the system a little less bad would make abolition less likely.
I love this question, Amy. Oh, this is good. Obviously, I like these types of things. So it depends. I don't think inherently improving conditions is a non-reformist reform. I only think it's that if it's tied to something bigger. So if your organization is only about improving conditions, it's probably a reform, and a reform that actually grows the state, because what you're saying is we just need a nicer, cleaner jail, and then our families will be better. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is, while our people are in there, while we're building towards a vision of getting rid of this, sure, there should not be scabies in jail. Sure, those jail cells should be clean. Sure, folks should not be living in their shit and piss, which many folks do. Yeah, that's unacceptable. That's inhumane. But if that is our single and only demand, that demand is not actually transformative enough. So I think when we're thinking about the demands that we're working with, you're thinking about the demands as demands. Do these demands believe in the police and prison state, or do these demands believe in abolition? If the demands believe in the police and prison state, it's a reform, and it's a reform that's going to grow the state. But if it's a demand that's like, that is a strategy to get us closer to ending the jailing and policing of our loved ones, then yep, it's a non-reformist reform.
Yeah, I think a great, I can give you an example of what it looks like on both sides. Oftentimes in the movement, we'll hear people say things like, we shouldn't have prisons. Instead, we should have rehabilitation campuses. And they should just look like colleges and have trees, and it should all be beautiful. That is reform, right? That is somebody who still believes that some human beings need to be locked away, and they should just have trees and painting classes when they do it. As opposed to non-reformist reform that still had to do with conditions, like AB 45, which was Initiate Justice Bill last year, which made it so that people in prisons and jails throughout California don't have to pay medical copays. They don't have to pay for medical care. Now, the reason why I would say that's a non-reformist reform is because the carceral state, prisons, jails, the punishment state is there to make money. It is there to extract resources from us. So by putting people, incarcerated people, in a position where we don't have to pay for our own medical care, that is something that is inherently shrinking the carceral state.
Thank you, Richard and Patrisse. There's a few questions that I'm gonna kind of like lump together and save for the end. So moving forward, the next question is from Shadiqua. With the history of racism and capitalism in this country, how likely do you think it is that we can actually dismantle the current model and replace it with a transformative model?
We're doing it. We're doing it. We're doing it every single day in the organizing that we're doing. I think sometimes as organizers, we have this like romantic idea that it's all going to come crumbling down across the country all at once, and then we're all going to rebuild. That's not actually how life works. Slavery was abolished and dismantled several times over. We're still in that, right? The prison system is a vestige of slavery. It's an old model, and so we're consistently uprooting something to build something else. And the idea, though, is that we have enough wherewithal this time that as we are getting rid of this thing, we're not rebuilding the same thing with a new face. And I think that's what's important. So in certain pockets of the country, and I would argue the world, there was really incredible models of what abolition looks like, of what challenging the police state and the prison state looks like. And we should look to those models and not feel so overwhelmed that we haven't done it all at once yet.
Yeah, like slavery was the internet of the 1500s through the 1800s. And by that, I mean, it was the primary driver of the global economy. It was the creator of the global economy, right? It was the biggest moneymaker in the world. The first mortgages that were ever created were created for slaves. The first money security, stocks, bonds, those types of things were all created for slaves. It was the most essential corner of the economy. To get rid of slavery in 1868 was equal to getting rid of the internet in 2020, and yet it was done, right? So it might be hard for us, and we can look at history and be like, the U.S. relies on police and prisons, but police and prisons have only existed in the way they've existed for 152 years, and we have transformed the world over numerous times, and I'm extremely confident that we can do it again. And I just wanted to share that as like a ray of hope for folks.
Yeah, and I think kind of in line with that, y'all are talking a little bit about like what it can look like institutionally. We have a question here from Sean asking if you can expand on imagining / creating a world without prisons, whether through art, dialogue, and community.
Sure. I think we practice, there used to be this blog called Everyday Abolition. And it was this really beautiful, powerful blog that looked at art and looked at writings and looked at what are the daily practices we can be inside of. So we're not sort of waiting for this abolitionist future that we long for. There are ways that we can relate to each other. Obviously, you know, the last year there was a bunch of challenges to white people in particular for calling the police on for calling the cops on Black people. I think, you know, we had to reckon with this conversation around like, don't call the police. And then if we're not calling the police, then what are we doing? It means that we're creating community around how we respond to violence and harm. And I think that's important. It's in this moment of COVID-19 where people are being forced to create community in ways that they haven't ever had to and ever needed to. We live in an American system that really is impacted by individualism. And so it's the first time in our history where we've been this vulnerable as a people in this country in this way, and where we've been connected to a global community. So I think it's important that we just give ourselves more grace in this moment and show up the best ways we know how. And that's abolitionist, to give yourself grace, to give the people around you grace, to take the time to imagine. We spent a lot of time these last 10 years on the ground when we were challenging this $3.5 billion jail plan. We asked people, what would you do with $3.5 billion? What would you do instead of building a jail, instead of giving it to the police? And it was probably one of the first times people ever felt like they were being asked their opinion on something that would impact them. And I think as organizers, as people who are in this work every day, we need to be asking ourselves and the people around us, what do we want to see? In this time right now, when we're in this vulnerable COVID-19 moment, ask yourself and the people around you, what kind of world do you want to live in? What do you want this world to look like right now while we're in it, but also when it's over? It's going to be over at some point. When, we don't know, but when it is, and when we have a vaccine and everybody has built up the antibody and all those things, what do we want it to look like? Do we want to look like a world that goes back to over-incarcerating and over-policing people? Or do we want to go live in a world that's closer to the vision of abolition?
I think it's important to say, like, it is very likely that you have an abolitionist space in the room that you're sitting in right now, right? So who here has ever had somebody in their family do something illegal to them and then didn't call the cops, right? Because we don't do our families like that. We might have brothers, cousins, aunties, whatever, who have stolen from us, who have hit us, who have whatever. And we have found ways to deal with that as a family without having to call the cops. Why? Because we already have built a culture of I love you, you love me, we're going to figure this out. I know you weren't at your best in that moment. I'm not going to do more harm to you. I just want to make sure you're not harming me. So what do we need to talk about to make sure that that happens? I think in our culture, which is so based on like your family is the only thing you have to worry about, it's really easy for us to do that. Even the cops, the judges, they do that within their own families too, right? They're not calling each other on their family members when they mess up. And when their family members do mess up, they try to get them off easy. I think the key is for us to expand who we see as our family. And when we see people acting out harmfully in our communities, or even when they're acting out harmfully towards us, that we build the practice of seeing ourselves in them. Like, yo, I see you, fam. I know you're not well. I'm hurt by what you're doing. We're not trying to minimize the harm, but we're saying we already have built capacities for restorative justice, transformative justice within our hearts towards our own families. Now we just need to expand who we see as family and treat everyone in our community that way.
Yeah, thank you for that. In the interest of time, I'm going to do like maybe just 2 or 3 more questions. So I'm just looking through these to see if I can kind of like get them to mesh together. But one question that we have is, well, there's a couple of questions here. Sierra asks, Patrisse, can you elaborate on number 12 in your 12 abolitionist practices working against the US state? You talk about how we should really use imagination, and I'd love to hear what you're dreaming/imagining. And then there's another question on how do we practice restorative justice in response to state violence, using the example of the Black man who was recently killed in San Leandro. So yeah, could you talk maybe a little bit about how we can use these practices in addressing state violence and doing this work every day to dismantle the violent U.S. state system?
Sure. I mean, the U.S. is the United States empire is in charge of a significant amount of harm. I mean, we're living in a country that's built on stolen land and stolen labor. Stolen land, indigenous people of Turtle Island, this land was stolen from them. Many of them are relegated to reservations. Many of them forgotten. And there's a huge conversation happening right now around this pandemic that people are not talking about Native American communities and how the pandemic is disproportionately impacting them. And so this conversation, is really critical. And then we're obviously living in a country that stole labor. It stole whole human beings from their homes and brought them here to build an entire nation and build its wealth. And that those human beings did not receive that. And so that's the foundation. It's a very bloody and violent and painful foundation that many of us live in. And then the US has also spent the last, 100 years dismantling governments across the country, including in Latin America and the Caribbeans, totally dismantling governments that were practicing socialism. And there's sanctions that this government has on Iran. There's sanctions even in this moment, COVID-19, Iranian people are one of the highest COVID-19 rates. We don't talk about it in this country, and we've starved them. We've kept the sanctions going even in this moment. How evil and cruel! And many of us who grew up here, whether we were born here or not, don't always understand how awful we've been to other places. And we don't have a strong internationalist framework. That's why I'm so grateful that Carly Stanley's here from Australia, kind of reminding us about communities across the globe. And so when I ended with Fight the US State and Don't Make It Stronger, because it's the US state that has allowed for this culture of punishment and revenge that's not just isolated to America, but actually lives beyond its borders and has deeply impacted people around the world and has dismantled whole governments. And so our job as people who are internationalists, I'm an internationalist, I'm not just a civil rights advocate, I'm a human rights advocate, is to challenge the place that I live, that I grew up in, to stop harm. And to not grow the harm that it's caused. And so that is a very important principle of mine, that I don't just think about people inside the US, that I think about everybody outside of the US, and I think about the planet as well. Oh, and I'm dreaming about all things. I'm dreaming about continuing to decarcerate our jails in this COVID-19 moment across the country, jails, prisons at the state and federal level. I'm thinking about how we build communities of care. I'm really excited about building a Los Angeles where I can raise my child in, and building a different kind of LA than I actually grew up in. So yeah, really grateful for that. And I know that there was a question about restorative justice when it comes to the state. It's hard and tricky. I think this conversation around what happens to killer cops, and so often they don't get prosecuted, and is that really the demand that we're asking for? A demand that some abolitionist groups have called for around police is actually decreasing their budgets, and calling for a decreasing of police budgets as a form of an abolitionist demand. I think for individual law enforcement that do cause harm, I think there can be a real community response around that, and really not just asking what the family wants, but what the community wants. I mean, obviously that police officer, there should be a zero tolerance. That police officer shouldn't have a job in policing, and there should be a real effort, I think, from the community around building transformative space. But it's a very tricky conversation because the police are so protected, and there are so many laws that have been built around them to keep them safe and keep them have their pensions and keep them and their families together. They actually practice transformative justice inside the police force with each other. They don't lose their jobs, they don't lose their connections, they don't lose their careers, they don't lose their livelihood like so many of our family members do when they cause harm, or even when they don't cause harm.
Yeah, thanks for that, Patrisse. So I'll just wrap it up with the last question then. A few folks asked this in different ways, but yeah, how can people become involved? What are action items that folks can take who are new to prison abolition?
I would say first and foremost, join an organization. We transform systems together. Nobody has ever changed the world by themselves. So join an organization that identifies itself as an abolitionist organization. Initiate Justice is one of them. Initiate Justice has member meetings, now digital member meetings, every first Wednesday of the month. So there's one coming up on May 6th. I believe it's also at 6:30 at the same time. And that is for anybody can be a member of Initiate Justice, and then people who are directly impacted can actually go through the Institute of Impacted Leaders and become organizers with Initiate Justice as well. But there are other abolitionist organizations. Initiate Justice does state work. Dignity and Power Now, which is the organization Patrisse founded, does county work. Reform LA Jails does county work, city work. Critical Resistance does state work. CURB does Californians United for a Responsible Budget does state work. There's no shortage of abolitionist organizations, but it's important that we're staying in community with one another, that we're always addressing and improving our politic, and that we're working together to bring an end to something, and not just kind of, there is no abolition with us working one by one.
Literally everything that Richard said. I agree with it completely. That's what I say when I give talks. Join an organization. Don't do it alone. It's too much work out there. There's so much good work happening. And I would say for anybody who's on this call that's like, you know what, everything that's around me sucks, I don't like any of these things, then build your own thing.
Exactly. Yeah, so on that note, a lot of folks in the chat box are sharing links to organizations, links to online webinars, readings. So please, take the opportunity to learn more about organizations near you, take the opportunity to expand your own knowledge and to practice abolition in your own everyday lives. So that being said, we are now going to engage in a little bit of an activity. You've been listening to Richard and Patrisse, talk very thoroughly about, what abolition actually means and, how we can, practice it in our everyday lives. But we're going to do a little bit of practice. So I'm going to let Richard and Patrisse facilitate this. And, they're going to be asking for people to share their own experiences. So if you volunteer to respond to the prompt that they're going to offer, please, volunteer in the chat box and I will find you and unmute you. And please also be aware, because I forgot to mention this at the beginning of the call, that this webinar is being recorded and we're going to be sharing it. So, bear that in mind when you share.
Cool. So the prompt is to think about a conflict that's happening in your life right now. So conflicts are inevitable, right? It's something that's happening that you don't want to be happening. It's a misalignment of desires. Dr. King talks about conflict being inevitable, and it's not necessarily good or bad. It's about what we do with it. So think about a conflict that's happening in your life right now. It can be structural. It could be, my son is locked up, or it can be immediate. It can be, my cousin, whatever, shook my hand without washing their hands first. And then the question, so that you'll take just a minute, 30 seconds to a minute to describe us what the conflict is, and then describe what would be a punitive response to that conflict, and then what would be an abolitionist response. And you don't have to have it perfectly right. If you can't think of what the abolitionist response is, we'll all chime in as a community and support you through figuring it out.
Right, so if you would like to volunteer to respond to this prompt, please go ahead and send me a chat and I will unmute you. Don't everybody go at once. Okay. All right. Kiana Martinez. Let me find you. You know what? There's an easier way to do this.
Thanks for being down to go first, Kiana. That's courageous.
For sure. All right, Kiana, you should be unmuted now.
Hello?
Yes, we hear you.
Cool. I'm a little nervous, but hello. So basically, I was gonna put this in the chat too, to ask, but basically, I have a aunt, and she grew up with me on and off, and I like respected her as a kid, because she used to like help us every so often. Like we didn't have books for schools and things, and so I like, in a way, like I guess I respected her. And after going to college and, you know, I guess eventually learning about abolition, I've been doing like housing rights organizing with different folks. And I posted a recent photo petition that we had put together on Facebook. And I've had different conversations with her that I felt that were like really insulting to me and to my community. And I feel like it's been hurtful, and I've been trying to like, sometimes I try to like ignore her, or not ignore her, but I try not to like talk to her as much. But when I do talk to her about things that I believe in and how to support the community. But this time, when I like had put so much work into organizing, it was a town hall with the governor and all these things. I felt like I had a lot of like work that I had put into it in my community. And she commented on it saying that, well, they should let people go back to work so that we don't have to cancel rent or anything. And I don't know why that like really got me really upset. And now I'm like, should I talk to her at all? And yeah, like how do I go about it after? I guess I haven't had too many conversations with her like recently in like the last year. But yeah, I'm like wondering how to respond to that. And to me, it's a conflict, but to her, I don't think she feels like it's that big of a conflict. But to me, it's really like affecting me, that I do now think that she doesn't care about me or my community. And to me, that's like harming us. And at this point, I feel like she's harming us, even though maybe she's not doing something like specific, but she's pushing back against like so many things that all my communities are pushing for, to have community care and a lot of the things that y'all just described. Sure. So sorry if that was a little long, but had to get a little context.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I could say something, and then Rich, please chime in. You know, I think this is important. I'm really glad we started with this example, because it may seem sort of small or like not that serious. And that's actually the most perfect place to practice being in community. And, you know, one thing that the reason why part of my abolitionist principles, I start with courageous conversations, because oftentimes communication is like one of the biggest reasons why we have downfalls in our community, right? Like, or downfalls in our interpersonal relationships. And so as an offering, less about advice, because you have to figure this out, you know, with yourself and what makes sense for you. But I think initiating a sit down conversation with your aunt and letting your aunt know how painful it is to hear these things and how important your message and what you are doing is for you, and that you have to, you know, set a boundary, whatever boundary that is with her, whether it's like, please don't say those things around me, or don't talk like that around me. Like, I need you to take this really seriously. And you may have to repeat your boundary, or you may need to repeat your need over and over again. But, you know, I think that it's really important to practice those types of things. And that's the courageous conversation. And it could feel scary, and it could feel, you know, and she may not take it well, or she may, who knows? But I think that's like really an important first step, and how you relate to this moment, and a good opportunity to practice how you want to be in community.
Yeah. So, Kiana, with all that Patrisse just said, like, what would be an example of a punitive response to your aunt, how she shows up?
I guess one would be not speaking to her at all, like ever. And another would be, I guess, maybe like attacking her in a certain way. Just like her character, things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's pretty much what we're taught to do, right? Cancel people, right? Or attack them and devalue them, dominate them. And given like what you've heard in this and what Patrisse just shared, what would be an abolitionist possibility?
Like Patrisse said, have a sit down talk with her and start with how it's very hurtful to me and it's hurtful to my community.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And to set boundaries. Yeah.
And I think what's so abolitionist about that is that you're centering the effect that it has on you. And you're like putting faith in her emotional ability as your aunt, as your family, as part of your community to like see you and be like, oh, I'm hurting this person, as opposed to sitting her down and being like, yo, if you don't stop, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And now you're using fear as the tool to try to get her to stop rather than connection. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's dope. Thank you so much, Kiana. Thank you for sharing that with all of us.
Love y'all. Love you, Patrisse. Love you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kiana, for being brave and being the first person to offer an example.
Heroes. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Okay. The next person who said that they had an example they wanted to share is Shadiqa. So Shadiqa, you should be unmuted now. You should be good to go.
Believe it or not, my example is nearly identical to Kiana's, and it involves my uncle, who I haven't spoken to in 8 years. 8 years, because he said something offensive to me about my career choice. And so my punitive response was to never talk to him again. And I haven't spoken to him in 8 years. But he is my uncle and I do love him. And we don't, like my family, we're not really, we don't have to have contact with each other anyway. So I don't even think he's losing any sleep over not talking to me. And I don't even think that he realizes that something is wrong. He's just kind of like, oh, we don't talk anyway, so it's not that big of a deal. So yeah, that it is pretty much the exact same example that Kiana gave, only my uncle, who I haven't spoken to in 8 years because of what he said.
And what does an abolitionist response feel like it could be?
Having a conversation with him and explaining to him how hurtful that conversation was, that he likely doesn't even remember anymore.
And I'd love to just add to Shadiqa, you know, if he was committed to acting the same way or to continue to hurt you, we're certainly not saying that we have to stay in those kind of relationships. But even that could require like, yo, I'm taking this boundary from you and this is why. You hurt me in this way, and therefore until you're willing to do something different, I'm gonna take space for my sake, for the sake of me, for my emotional sake. But it's not to punish you or harm you, it's just to protect me, and I hope that you can reconcile with what you're doing to me and change it, and we can be back in community. That can be an abolitionist response as well.
Thank you.
I also just will say that, you know, that response of not talking to him for 8 years, don't have judgment of that response. Like, that's what you needed, and that's where your spirit was. And I'm pretty sure like that's probably how you were taught in your own family structure. Like, someone makes you upset, well, fuck them. Like, I don't need them in my life. And those are very normal, nurtured responses to keep us safe. Like, those are safety responses, and that is actually okay. So I don't want you to feel judgment. It's about, for me especially, and unlearning a lot of the practices I was taught and relearning practices that I believe in, is about it's about who I want to be and about what I want to teach my children and the people around me, and it's about like, how do we expand ourselves? And as Richie said, like, you know, you may have that conversation, your uncle may not remember it. Maybe your uncle is losing sleep and does miss you too. And it's a transformative moment for him if you choose to reach out. And I think that's important, you know? And at the end of the day, this work it's about all of us, and it has ripple effects and it impacts all of us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patrisse. The next person who volunteered is Christina. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, Christina. Let me try.
Okay, here I go. Yeah,
yeah.
I got it. There's probably two things. One is I have a friend that I grew up with since we were really young, and he's been incarcerated for about 24 years now for second-degree murder. And I lost my son 2 years ago in January. He accidentally shot himself playing around with a gun. And 1 month after that, I find out that my friend has a brain tumor. And then we find out that he has stage 4 cancer, but it's within the tumor. The Stanford doctor told him that he should not get don't let them do a biopsy or cut him open. It's too dangerous where the position is. And another doctor from San Diego said that he wanted to do a biopsy and then give him radiation and chemotherapy. So he went through the whole process. I advocated for him trying to get a third opinion before that happened. And the biopsy, what took an hour procedure, ended up being 5 hours to stop the bleeding. And they were surprised that he, lived through it, that he made it. But now 2 years go by, and he just barely finished chemo, and they keep taking him to get MRIs, but they put him in the wrong machine because he's too big. He's too tall for it. So then they have to reschedule. And every time he comes back to the prison, they lose all his medical paperwork, and they treat him as if he just got there, like he was a brand new prisoner. And it's been a constant cycle of that. I've hit up the SAC CDCR health system or whatever and tried to talk to them. And they'd say is, oh, he's doing okay. Or he's, without even coming to no resolution or no help. I've talked to the doctors. I went above them, and I even went to the ombudsman, and I'm like not getting help. But this is the reason why I got into this movement, is because it's been 6 years, total since I started doing this. And this is the reason, to find the answers to do whatever I can do to advocate for him. And one of his close friends, also had a heart attack and was having problems, and he got, surgery. But it's like there's a very big delay on helping them. He's in there suffering right now. They think the tumor shrunk, and he probably has more tumors now because of how long it's taken, and not using like the gamma knife to get rid of it or whatever because of the contract, making him go all the way to San Diego instead of to the Bay because he's at Salinas Valley, so it's like that type of stuff. And everybody that I've talked to, it's like I have no help or no direction. So I know that my part in the, abolishment, is that what it is? Abolishment response or whatever. Abolition, however you say that word. My response to that, is, going and trying to do that. I even reached out to an attorney who wrote back and wanted permission with our signatures, but nothing became of it. So I don't know exactly what else to do in that situation. So yeah, that's kind of my dilemma, my conflict that's going on in my life right now.
Mm-hmm.
So sorry to hear about your son and what your friend and his friend are going through. So if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is like just the overall lack of healthcare in the system is the conflict that you're describing.
Yeah. And then also not being able to, I keep trying to go through every avenue, even talking to, Ralph Diaz, secretary of CDCR, and still he was willing to help, but he doesn't read emails, so it's kind of like really hard to get in a direction. And that's the reason why I teamed up with so many different organizations, is just to get this information and find out, get support. I need support.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say also my condolences for your loss of your son, but also just the situation with one of your good friends. I think you're already practicing abolition and your approach and what you're doing and how you're, how you're responding and what you're getting. And so like, just glad that you had the space to share that with all of us. If there's any support that we could provide, I think we can, you can offline us and you can, chat in, Richard, Taina, or I, or you can email Initiate Justice. And if there's anything that we can do to support you, if the person's in California or even outside of California, we can definitely do that. But I think you're living in an abolitionist context right now as you're relating to your close friend. It's really powerful. And I hope we can provide support if you need that, and we can, definitely do that off of this webinar. And I hope you can get that support.
I appreciate that. And then the other quick thing was with my son. He was 18. He started his own, thing with the youth to stop the cycle of, how our parents were either killed or end up in prison because of gang violence and things. So he started his own movement called Run Rich Boys, and that's in music. So after I lost him, I had to take over because he had a whole group of kids and people wore the clothing and they all wanted to be a part of it. So that's another direction that I want to push forward more, to involve the youth, because there's a lot of kids out here that wants to be a part of that, to help those that are incarcerated and be entrepreneurs. That's the whole focus in what they do. So they film, they do music, they write, they do whatever, just anything in entertainment business, as an entrepreneur business and all that. So that's another, thing that I want to kind of get, that's a conflict, trying to get started with that, like really take it somewhere, because it can be very big.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that as well.
Thank you, appreciate it.
So I think we have time for one more person, and that's Crystal. Crystal, you should be unmuted.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so this activity is perfect because I haven't responded to the situation. Feel free to stop me if I misunderstood. So I have an incarcerated loved one. And once a week, my mom goes to our local church to get fruit that's been donated. So she's been telling me that for the past few weeks, there's this woman there who makes comments such as, like, for example, they brought up that a lot of people were going to be released. A lot of cholos, how you say it in Spanish, it translates to like gangsters. And this woman says comments like, no, why do we want them out here? Leave them in there. They deserve to be in there. They know what they did to be in there. They should have thought of this before. If they get infected in there, they must have done something to, get themselves sent there, blah, blah, blah. So these comments have been going on for like a few weeks. And for the last few weeks, when my mom tells me she's pretty upset, I get like, so I tell my mom, next time I'm gonna go with you. Next time I'm gonna go with you. And as I'm coming to these webinars, I'm thinking of ways to like translate it in Spanish so that I can go and tell the lady like this and that, So, but I think at times I do let my emotions get to me, like the comebacks I think of in my head are sometimes not okay. So I think that would be more of like the punitive response, because I get so defensive and honestly just angry that she says things like this. So yeah, I haven't seen this woman. I don't know if you guys have any feedback or if I just completely misunderstood the activity.
No, you did great.
Yeah, I think you get the activity completely. So what do you think a potential abolitionist response would be?
The first thing I thought of was to say like, to just do your research on why people are incarcerated, you know, what some of them had to do here to survive, and then some of those decisions led them to be incarcerated. Kind of difficult with the language barriers, and I'm learning a lot with these webinars. I don't know if I've internalized it enough to go and preach it to someone already.
Mm-hmm. You know, sometimes just simply telling someone how you feel is goes a long way. And I said this to, who was the first speaker? Kiana? Yeah, Kiana, right? You can simply tell her, it makes me really uncomfortable when you talk about the people that I love like that. And it makes me uncomfortable because, you know, that's someone that I love, or makes me really uncomfortable when we other people in that way, because everybody deserves to have their dignity. Like, you can really come from a heartfelt place. It doesn't have to be like, well, researched and here's the statistics. And most people tune out when they hear research and statistics, like that doesn't move them. But telling someone how you feel and the impact it has on you, and that it feels really disrespectful to talk about human beings in that way, it can go a long way. She may not hear you, she may not care, but it's more about how you want to show up in that moment. And you never know, like you may transform her over time. But I do think, like, if you were to go, or even if your mom feels uncomfortable coaching your mom, how do you say, you know, I don't want to hear that when I come here. It makes me really uncomfortable because I believe in these people, and it's things like that got them in places like this. So you can really come from a feelings place, and you could feel defensive if you want to. That's a human emotion. I think, you know, like cursing someone out and telling them that they're trash, that's different. That's definitely a punitive response. But saying to someone, you know, this really hurts my feelings. I feel really uncomfortable. I don't like this. I don't like what you're saying. That's an entryway into creating a new culture around how we relate to each other.
Thank you.
All right, Richard, did you want to add anything, or we get to wrap up?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Crystal, for sharing. Thank you, everybody who shared and everybody who asked questions. Like, that was very courageous of all of you. So I want to just, you know, pass it back to Richard and Patrisse to close us out.
I just want to say thank you all so much for being on here, for your interest in prison abolition. You know, as somebody who was in prison for 7 years, abolition is not even something that a lot of people believe in prison. It's like we talked about, that's not the way that we're trained to think. And it's only through these conversations where we're purposefully trying to evolve our politic and understand how to be more caring with each other and build another world that we'll actually be there. So I just really appreciate you all staying through to the end. I really encourage you guys, if you're not already a member of Initiate Justice, to come to the Initiate Justice virtual member meeting next Wednesday, 6:30, same time, just a week from now. The link is in their Instagram bio. It's also at initiatejustice.org, so you can join that so we can keep the fight going.
Oh.
Sorry, I keep muting. Thank you. I'm just very grateful. This was I learned a lot on this call. Super grateful for y'all. Thank you for bearing with the screaming child and the barking dog. And just a lot of, mutual gratitude around being able to have this conversation, especially in this moment. And thank you, Initiate Justice and Taina, for facilitating and being back in support for this webinar. Taina put in a lot of work to get us to the place where Richard and I were at today, really created the infrastructure for this webinar. So I just want to thank you personally, Taina. I want to thank Initiate Justice for all the work that you do for all of us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Richard and Patrisse. Thank you, everybody, for being on. So as Richard said, next week, we're taking a break from Webinar Wednesday because it's our monthly member meeting. So if you would like to learn directly how you can get involved in the various campaigns Initiate Justice is working on, please join us Same time, next Wednesday, May 6th, the link to RSVP is on all of our social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and on our website. And it's the same process to RSVP. You'll fill out a Google form, and then we'll email you the link to register through Zoom. The following week, Wednesday, May 13th, we'll be on legal advocacy, and we'll be joined by one of my favorite attorneys, Caitlin Henry of the Prisoner Advocacy Network, who will be talking about how you can advocate on behalf of your incarcerated loved ones using legal avenues. So that'll be May 13th, and we'll have the RSVP information on our website and social media then as well. So yeah, that being said, thank you everybody so much. Yes, this was recorded. We are going to post it on our website. So if you would like to follow up later on, please do that. Thank you all so much. Have a great night.